Good afternoon. I'm Judith Chandler, the Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research and the Chair of the Productivity Commission. The Productivity Commission was set up in 2021 as part of the ESRC-funded Productivity Institute. Productivity Institute is a wide-ranging network of researchers around the country trying to understand, explain and develop policies that are addressing the UK's marked slowdown in productivity growth since the financial crisis. The Productivity Commission is our attempt to collect evidence from experts and draw them together in a series of reports that will understand the problem from the perspective of policymakers and hopefully drive us towards better policies in the future to try and address the productivity problem which the UK suffers, and something that affects nearly every aspect of economic life in front of us. Many have described it as the most important problem facing the UK at the moment, and in some sense we think maybe underpinning some of the political churn as well as successive governments have tried to deal with the slowdown in productivity. This afternoon we're holding our third evidence session this year on the question of investment. We put out a position paper late last year on the investment problem that the UK faced. Investment is one of the key inputs into the production function, is something that we think is critically associated with productivity slowdown. And we've been able to take evidence on business investment earlier this year and public investment. And we're constructing those along with today's evidence session, which is on FDI, into two reports that we publish later this year. The first will be looking strictly at the evidence that's been discussed at these evidence sessions, but also sent in on a written basis. And that will be written by one of our senior fellows, Catherine Mann. And later on in the year, we will turn these into some policy ideas, prescriptions, solutions, choose your word as it see fit, written by Paul Fisher, who's also a senior fellow attached to the Productivity Commission. FDI has and is often related in so many empirical studies to faster economic growth. And I say economic growth in terms of GDP or output per head, not strictly in terms of output per se. But of course, it doesn't take a lot of reading to understand that that's a very nuanced statement. It depends on the type of FDI, its longevity, and also its interaction with a large number of domestic conditions, which can be the extent to which it drives infrastructure expenditure or is acquisitional in the sense of getting hold of resources or knowledge or leading to transfer. All of these initial conditions, in a sense, interact with the ultimate impact that FDI might have in an economy. So to get at a better measure of its impact and how and what type we ought to be bringing into the country to foster growth, I'm delighted this afternoon to welcome our three witnesses who bring with them a tremendous level of experience and knowledge on international economics. And we're looking forward to hearing their views, not only today, but as we move on in this inquiry. So I welcome them not only to today's evidence session, but more generally to the process of us understanding generally the productivity problem that the UK faces. I will not go through a long introduction, although I'll simply welcome Davide Castellani, who's Professor of International Business and Strategy at the University of Reading, Riccardo Crescenzi, who's Professor of Economic Geography at the LSE, and Reza Moghadam, who's the Chief Economic Advisor at Millennium Capital Partners. We'll start with a short introduction from you, and some opening remarks, which I'll ask you to keep to 2 or 3 minutes. We'll go from Davide to Riccardo to Reza in surname alphabetical order, and then we will have 4 separate sections of some 20 minutes or so with an individual commissioner leading on those questions to you. You're not, in a sense, obligated to answer the questions, but just weigh in and give us what you think the answers are. And we will build upon that when we think about our report as to the importance of FDI that a country such as the UK has to try and manage. So perhaps I can start with you, Davide, first. And thank you very much for coming over, especially from Italy, for this today's session. It's tremendously grateful to be received.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to be providing evidence to this Productivity Commission. As I said, I'm a professor of international business at the Henley Business School, University of Reading. My research revolves around questions such as why firms internationalize, where do they locate their activities, and what are the effects of these choices on local economies and firms. Now, probably not surprising, being an economist working in business school, I will bring a perspective which highlights the role of firms, and in particular, the idea that to understand the effect of FDI on productivity, we need to understand the microeconomic or the business-related business-level mechanism. And in this, of course, the multinational enterprise is a key actor. Multinational enterprise tend to be more productive than other firms and more multinational enterprise, and this could be for many reasons related to their size, to their innovation, and to the sectors where they're active. And so attracting multinationals means receiving a bundle of assets that can correlate with more productivity. But one point that I'd like to make is that multinationals have a specific source of productivity advantage, and in particular, there are many, but the ones that I want to single out is the fact that they manage business across borders. And to do that, they need to develop very sophisticated managerial capabilities. And so that's a defining characteristic of multinational enterprise. This requires hiring talented managers, developing managerial practices, and this becomes part of the skill set of the workers employed in MNEs. And we understand that managerial practices is a key element of productivity of firms. And we also know that in the UK ranks pretty low in some of the managerial practices scores. There was an article in the Financial Times just a couple of days ago highlighting how the UK ranks in the bottom of the G7 in investment in training, development, human resource processes and systems, and implementing efficiency improvement. We also know from the management expectation survey that foreign-owned firms tend to have much better managerial practices, like 40% higher scores than non-multinational enterprise. And we know from the pioneering research by Nick Bloom and John Marina that managerial practices tend to be correlated with productivity. So that the question is, how multinationals can contribute to the productivity of the local economies and in the UK through various channels, including transferring their best practices. And so I hope there will be a chance also to discuss this in terms of mobility of workers and imitation of these practices. And incidentally, if we take this perspective, even multinationals leaving the country can leave something behind them. So because these skills that are embedded in people, they can remain in the economy. And there's a study that I'm doing with some Swedish colleagues where we show that managers joining startups teams, the startup that where in the founding teams there's some managers from multinationals that tend to go much faster than the other startups. So there's something to be gained by exploring this specific expertise of multinationals.
Thank you. Very helpful and clear. Ricardo.
Thank you. Let me join David in thanking everyone for inviting us and be part of this meeting that is very helpful, and very much look forward to further discussions on today's topic and more generally on the issue of productivity slowdown. I will bring in a perspective that I feel is complementary to David's, looking at three key dimensions of foreign direct investment, not only the issue of the attraction of new investment, but also understanding what drives the expansion of foreign activities in the domestic economy, as well as trying to understand divestment, trying to understand what are the drivers and what are the impact of divestment decision by multinational firms. And I've been looking at these three key dimensions from the perspective of global value chains. So trying to bring the decisions of multinational firms within a wider set of strategies that are not necessarily pursued through foreign affiliates, but also involve, for example, contracts, that also involve joint ventures, as well as involve trade patterns. And by looking at foreign direct investment in a global value chain perspective, we can also better understand the role of different layers of suppliers. So we can look at how, by participating in global value chains, even firms that are not directly exporting, for example, or are not foreign owned, might participate to global production networks through particular gateways. So, like, understanding FDI as part of wider decisions that at the same time involve trade and investment simultaneously, I think can enrich our understanding of foreign direct investment and better understand the possible impacts of foreign direct investment in the host economy when it comes to productivity and welfare more generally. Finally, like, I think what I would like to discuss with the Commission is the perspective of what drives different investments to different places. So the location strategies of foreign firms, the impacts of this investment, as well as the public policy dimension that I think is very important. So try to, like, ask the question what works, going beyond, like, our positive understanding of investment strategies and their impacts to take on board the normative perspective that looks at tools that have been proven to work in practice in order to facilitate, for example, the attraction of investment, as well as their embeddedness in the local economy, as well as in terms of retention. So I think we need these three key aspects: the location, understanding strategies in a GVC framework, understanding the impacts of foreign direct investment, as well as, like, really looking into the public policies that work when and if a public policy intervention is needed. Okay, so to understand what is the rationale for public policies dealing with foreign direct investment, dealing more generally with the global location of capital, but also if there is a rationale for public policy intervention, what are the tools that work and to achieve what type of objectives.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent start. President, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you. Good to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. And I must confess my expertise in this area are much more limited than my co-panelists here. Perhaps I would draw on my experience at the IMF and my last 10 years of experience working here in the financial sector and draw on that. As you know, every IMF program that I've worked on, at least, was based on the assumption, or rather the hope, of increasing FDI and inflows into whatever the economy was. Sometimes it worked.
So what was that forecast line, wasn't there?
Actually, usually it was like this. Usually, if I did all of them, it goes like this. As the program is implemented, you have massive inflation. But of course, there are policies to underpin that. But I think perhaps more precisely, I wanted to mention just 7 issues that I have come across working in finance, in international finance, both companies that I've worked with are international, and just 7 things I've come across that I think, and I can go through specifics with examples in each of them. So the 7 things that are important in terms of investment decisions in finance here. Number 1, market access. Obviously, the size of the domestic market, but the access you gain through that market to other adjacent or international markets, very, very important. And obviously in London, being able to have market access to Europe and a lot of emerging market economies from here is a sort of key attraction. Number 2, and I'm giving these in my perception of the rank order. Number 2, talent. Ability to attract talent is very, very high among the financial firms, and being able to recruit locally and internationally into the team. Number 3, political and social stability is a key factor. It's been a factor that has supported the City of London in the past, at least. Number 4, regulatory, I would say, predictability and credibility. You do not want rule changes all the time, but you want to be in an environment where the regulatory environment is viewed as credible, but also fairly predictable. Number 5, stable taxation system, I would mention it. And I think in this area, probably for services firms, key decision is more on social security and labor taxation. Corporate taxes come down, but are important, but not, I would say, in what I have seen, not as important as some of the fixed payroll taxes that we pay. And we can go through the details of that, at least some of the examples I can share with you. Number 6, network effects. And for example, having other similar firms, having clients, having other firms that service you, as well as other clients of theirs that are similar, that sort of reinforces an ecosystem. That ecosystem is very, very important. We can talk about this in the context of Brexit if you want. And finally, a supportive infrastructure. And by that, I do not mean necessarily physical infrastructure, but physical infrastructure also does come into that. Things like being able to arrive and depart the country easily. Things like in finance, for example, the size of trading floors matter a lot. To be able to have lateral offices and very, very important in that infrastructure, IT networks that support you. Finance is very, very IT intensive, and to be able to have that sort of degree of support and infrastructure network is very important. So those are the sort of 7 things I've come across. We can, as you progress, I can come back to some of those and give examples that we can get into IMF programs.
Getting into them is easy. Getting out of them is
Well, it needs FBI. It needs FBI.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Actually, I think we've got 3 wonderfully complementary witnesses today. I think so. I'm very much looking forward to this session. But as I said earlier on, this will not be the only point of interaction with us. We want to continue to work with you on the important questions in front of us. I wonder if I may now turn to Stephen, who will spend a little bit of time trying to get to grips with some of the quantum issues with FDI. If I might, Stephen, perhaps we could spend about 10 minutes on this section if we can. Okay. I'll show you Steve Miller, the Deputy Director of the National Institute, with emphasis on macroeconomic modelling and forecasting. I think that's right.
That is very good. Thank you. Okay, so Davide spent quite a bit of time explaining why FDI matters for productivity. So I was wondering if Ricardo or Reza, if you have anything to add to what Davide said about FDI bringing in some better management and leaving behind better processes. Or is there more to FDI than productivity?
Yeah, I think Davide covered like a number of important factors that link FDI with productivity. I think it's important to understand the productivity impact of FDI with reference to both the strategies of the foreign-owned firms, and so we should not assume, and it is part of the fate, for example, of the International Monetary Fund on the local benefits of FDI. And we have seen these, for example, if you look at Central Eastern Europe, there was this expectation that attracting FDI would per se bring knowledge spillovers, employment on the ground, but these benefits have not necessarily materialized. Why? I think there are 2 important answers. The first is that firms and foreign firms do not operate in the host economy in order to share knowledge or to share managerial practices with their host economy. So the foreign companies fundamentally act to their own interest and maximizing their own objective function. So the issue is, we really need to understand how and to what extent and under what conditions they will share for example, their knowledge, or they will transfer some of their managerial practices to local firms that might be their competitors. And this happens, and the strategic management literature, for example, has been very rich in discussing this. This happens to the extent to which they perceive that by sharing, they can get a net benefit. So what they get from the interaction is more than what they lose. So firms will constantly compare what they have to gain in terms of sharing, for example, with their suppliers, certain best practices vis-a-vis what they lose by sharing these knowledge, these ideas that others might benefit from. And what research suggests is that not all foreign firms are good in terms of generating this type of spillovers. Some firms extract from the host economy more than they actually did. What we consistently find is that, for example, the bigger technological giants, so the big firms everyone is trying to attract to their local jurisdictions, are the ones that, being bigger and having better managerial practices to ring-fence their internal knowledge and their best practices, are also the ones that give out less to the host economy, because they tend to interact less with the local economy, because they are less in need of this interaction, because they have more within the firm boundary. So to give you an example, Google, like a super large company, can find more within its own corporate boundaries than a more medium-sized company that needs more suppliers, they need to externalize more, and therefore has more incentives to interact with local suppliers, with other local companies, to share, exchange knowledge, for example, or to transfer best practices to other firms in the same ecosystem. So I think there is part of the story is about really understanding what are the incentives for foreign firms to share knowledge and transfer something to the host economy. And on the other hand, there is the issue of absorbing capacities. So how and to what extent the firms in the host economy really have the capacity to absorb the potential productivity spillovers generated by foreign firms. And this is linked with the technological distance, for example. Again, that's why we argue that these big technological giants sometimes work at a level of technological sophistication that is too far remote vis-a-vis the capabilities of domestic firms. And therefore, learning opportunities are much more constrained vis-a-vis, for example, the presence of a more balanced type of portfolio of firms operating in the local economy, and more like medium-sized firms, innovative firms might be more prone to interact, and therefore leading to bigger spillovers to the local economy. So I think it's very important to qualify the statement on the potential impacts of foreign investments for productivity, understanding, okay, what type of FDI, as was mentioned in the introduction, what are the incentives for foreign companies to exchange knowledge with the local environment, and what are the capabilities of the local ecosystem more generally, not only firms, but also university and research center to interact and benefit from foreign direct investment.
Thank you very much. Fraser,
Again, let me focus on finance here, maybe an anecdote here. When I was working for an American bank after Brexit had been decided, and to serve the European clients, it was necessary to essentially open up a subsidiary in the EU. I was quite struck that the European regulators were quite keen on the idea of big American banks opening up there. And their logic was that the kind of efficiency of the American financial system can help basically the efficiency of the European banking system, which had been obviously damaged after the great financial crisis. So much more than jobs and investment and so on, they thought. And so that to me tells me that, at least in this area of finance, there is productivity enhancing associated with financial investment in the country. Now, of course, you need competitive market, you need a level playing field. I mean, so those have to be applied, provided through regulation and policy. But it suggested to me that that is the case now. So I think when you do have players who are at the sort of cutting edge, entering a market which perhaps is not at the cutting edge, at least in the financial sector, that is the case. Now, I think this issue is important, which I don't think it so much applies in finance, that are you really just extracting rent, or are you helping improve economic efficiency? Now, I would argue in finance, you probably do help economic efficiency, because the ultimate objective is to provide services for the local economy. And so if you can provide those cheaper, more efficiently for the local economy, then it must be productivity enhancing. But the regulation plays a big part here, because obviously for a smaller financial player, it's much more difficult to do that. For a much bigger financial player, it's easier to provide to deal with the enormity of the regulatory requirements. So there are issues to, I think, in terms of the size of the firms here.
Can I just add to what Riccardo has said and qualified with the arguments I made at the beginning? Of course, something that we always need to take into consideration is that there are negative effects from multinationals. There are crowding out effects in the factor markets. This will turn out to be productivity reducing, simply because if you have sticky factor markets, then you sell less, then you show up as less productive. But most importantly, you have crowding out effects in the labor market, for example. So war for talents, multinationals bid in wages, and this kind of negative effect local companies. And on the other hand, you have also pecuniary externalities. So Riccardo mentioned, of course, the willingness of multinationals to share, which is, of course, sharing knowledge is always difficult. But some of these externalities that come with the presence of multinationals can be bought in the market, for example, by hiring inventors that work for multinationals, having business to business relationship with these firms, and some of these practices are learned through these interactions, despite the fact that multinationals are willing to share. And so I think it's important that we think about externalities not only in terms of knowledge which is in the air and it's available to share, but also market-mediated externalities where, in this case, multinationals can act as anchor tenant firms in the local market that provide some factors that would otherwise not be available, and so would be much more expensive in the sense to find a good manager if it wasn't being trained by multinational, a high cutting-edge scientist or intermediate products that your company can buy. So all of these things are also part of the increasing, potentially increasing productivity for local economies.
Thank you. We can very quickly turn to the UK itself, and what do you see as the long-term trends in FDI flows in the UK? How do they compare with other advanced economies, and where, in particular, what's the regional distribution of FDI like for the UK? Riccardo, if you want to start again.
Well, if you look at the most recent data released by the government on FDI inflows, we see a generally positive trend vis-a-vis the post-pandemic, the pre-pandemic situation. However, I think the problem that we start seeing is exactly in a comparative perspective. In the sense that if we compare recent FDI data in the UK with other G7 economies, we do see that the post-pandemic rebound in the UK is much more limited vis-a-vis other advanced economies. So we have been able to recover the pre-pandemic levels, yes, but to a much smaller extent, vis-a-vis other advanced economies. And I think this shows where the problem is.
In terms of the regional distribution.
So this is if you look at the aggregate matter. So in general, we are seeing less than we would expect and I think this is linked with all the 7 points that were touched upon before in terms of the huge uncertainty, the lack of policy, of a stable policy framework, the changes in what is predictable and what is not. So there are a number of reasons behind that. I don't want to anticipate. But if we look at the data as they are, I think even if we do see like a generally positive trend, this is significantly less positive than other comparable economies in the G7 and in the EU more specifically. In terms of distribution of FDI, of course, in this framework, the most disadvantaged areas are the ones that suffer the most, because in a framework where there is less dynamism in terms of FDI attraction and also a more limited activity in terms of expansion of activities vis-a-vis what we would have seen if the UK continued the pre-pandemic trend. Clearly, the distribution of this more limited dynamism is not even in space, and it materializes significantly in the less advanced areas of the country, the ones that were lagging behind already before. So this, in a sense, intersects with the leveling up agenda and makes the possibility to leverage FDI as a tool to level up productivity in the country more challenging.
Thank you. Jason.
I think the data that you circulated as background to the meeting is obviously quite telling. But if I go back to the 7 points in terms of financial firms' decision-making for investment, market access has clearly deteriorated because of not having at least as easy and certainly diminishing access to the European market in terms of finance. Finance is highly regulated. If the regulatory system in the UK is separate to that on the continent, it simply makes it impossible for firms to view that as a part of the market when you invest here. Is that something that could be addressed? Yes. I think many in finance were surprised this was not part of the initial agreement of the separation laws. Can it be addressed over time? Yes. Talent also an adverse effect, because obviously a pool of talent that was readily available, now you have to go through permits and so on. And here, I must say, at least from what I have seen, the experience has been okay, because obviously the authorities here, the officials, have realized that this is an issue, and so they have been trying proactively, at least for the financial firms, to make sure that talent can cross borders without much difficulty. Political and social stability, obviously, that has been an issue in the UK. Regulatory predictability and credibility, I think, is still there, but obviously some people worry about this. Stable taxation system, I think that's more of a global issue. All countries are facing challenges after the financial crisis and COVID. So that isn't anything that's UK specific. Network effects are being affected because I've seen that in the firms that I've worked with, because you have to split people to serve different markets, and that means your network effect, the ecosystem that you have is affected. And supporting infrastructure, I think they're mixed, because obviously both because of COVID and Brexit, obviously for example, office space is more easily available, so that's mixed. But on the whole, when you look at my7 this, and if you're an international firm, certainly in finance, you would look at those 7. It has deteriorated.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't really want to echo what has been said. Of course, we've seen a drop in the inward FDIs in the UK. Whether this is like a temporary drop or a fail to rebound, or it's in the equilibrium, it's to be seen. Clearly, some things have changed. So market access, in particular, those investments that were those firms, multinational firms investing in the UK to use the UK as a platform to export. And I think that the car industry, 95% of the car industry is owned by foreigners, and 8 out of 10 cars produced in the UK were aimed at foreign markets. And so for some of these producers, in the long term, maybe the UK will not be as attractive. Similarly, global supply chains. So the UK has been suffering in the last few years for those goods where there's an intensive trade of intermediate goods. And again, the car industry is another is an example of this. The UK specializes more in certain parts than in others. We export engines, for example. How does this is affected by the new landscape? But of course, there are some potentially positive news ahead of us. The UK is still a large market. And so for investors looking to serve the UK market, there is room to invest in the UK. The other area where investments have been growing is R&D centers. And this leads us also to probably the need to think about FDI in a more granular way, move beyond sectors or combine a sector perspective with a business activity perspective. So R&D centers versus production facilities, versus business services headquarters. And so in that respect, of course, the UK has certain areas of expertise, like in life sciences, where there's potential to attract a lot of R&D centers. Let me highlight this. One thing that is probably neglected in the debate, which is in order to be really attractive and maintain the lead in this particular field, the UK needs to be attractive for talents coming to the UK. And immigration rules are a vital part of this. And so we should probably think about policies towards FDI as interlinked with trade policy, but also with immigration rules. And there's a study that I've just seen presented at a conference on the US, showing that when the US introduced more stricter controls on visas, innovation declined and firms were forced to move their R&D overseas sometimes. This leads me to another interesting fact that we observed in the last few years, which is an increase in the outward investments. So an increasing number of UK firms are moving to the EU or elsewhere because they want to be able to access the European market more easily. If you look at the France and Germany and UK FDI or cross-border investment flows, it went from more French and German investors coming to the UK until 2015, 2016 to very strong negative balance. Now more UK investors are going to Germany and France, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because there's literature that also highlights that by going abroad, that firms can learn, so they can increase in productivity. But of course, that also links to problems with the balance of payments, which for many years, inward FDI have been financing the UK current account deficit. And with inward FDI declining, how is the UK sustaining the current account deficit when also some of their exports may depend on multinationals not coming? So that's a broader issue, of course, but
that's great. Thank you very much.
I can come back to one issue. I forgot on the regional. Sure. You asked a question on the regional aspect. I think it's an important aspect. Again, I go back to finance, and it's underappreciated. A lot of the international firms, they're viewed as being London-based, but that's while the headquarters in London, a lot of back offices are outside London. All the major international firms have big outside London presence in terms of back offices. The firm I worked with, they had a very big office in Glasgow, for instance. So that is not often sort of highlighted.
So I pick up on the geography elements just very, very quickly. What the data shows is that there's some sort, the distribution of FDI in the UK is very skewed. So London accounts for 40% of investments typically. And this share has been declining slightly. And so apparently there's a leveling up, but it's not because the investments have increased outside of London. They've become relatively stable. So you have a leveling up because London is losing more than the rest, which is not necessarily what we want. And the other thing about leveling up is that I don't think the policy should aim at moving investors from London to elsewhere, but more to attract investments in other areas of the countries which do not compete with London. They compete with similar areas outside the UK. So it's important to understand who are the competitors of Birmingham, Leeds, Glasgow, and they are certainly not London, because going back to the business activities type of perspective on FDI, Scotland attracts much more manufacturing investment than London. So it's not that investment from London can go to Scotland, but Scotland competes with other parts of Europe and maybe outside Europe. And so this is where policy should probably target their efforts.
Thank you very much. That's a good segue, I think, into the next section, which Mark is going to lead on the makeup of international investment.
While we switch to Bart, let me invite anyone who wants to send some questions into the chat to do so. Even if we don't get time to answer them today, they're ones that we can collect and deal with in due course. Thank you, Celia. Bart.
Right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So first of all, sorry I can't join you there. I was at the International Institute yesterday, but the train strikes make it very difficult to find your way back home. The Protein Institute is headquartered in the north, so that's where I live. And the train strikes are not particularly helpful to support regional integration in the UK at this point. Anyway, also, it's a bit challenging to hear the discussion, but I can follow most of it. But forgive me if my questions are already been mentioned, and just please do so. Clearly, there has already been some discussion about the makeup of investment, but I really want to deep dive a little bit more to identify whether we've been seeing any changes in trends in the makeup of investment in recent years in the UK, and to what extent that could have a possible negative or potentially positive effect if we change it around. So, there's some evidence in some of the material that was also added to the meeting that some of the motivations for foreign direct investment inflows in the UK are now much more focused on access to the local market, or perhaps potential access to the local market rather than export. So we've seen a bit of that shift. Seems to have seen more of a shift of a focus on accessing technologies by multinationals rather than being part of an innovation ecosystem. But at the same time, we also have seen a bit of stabilization about foreign firms that are already operating in the UK that are now sort of settling into the new post-Brexit situation and perhaps sort of re-establishing themselves into the local ecosystem. So I wonder if all of the witnesses could give us a little bit more feel for whether they believe those trends are correct, but also to what extent they think that could be having an impact on productivity, and whether we're seeing some recent changes or ideas on how to turn that around.
So would you like to start, or you want to?
I can try.
Thank you.
And get started. I think, like, in part, the answer to this question links with what Davide was discussing before about, like, understanding the functions pursued by different investment. And I think that's where, like, having a global value chain logic, where we think about the products from the research and development, design, and then looking at the whole, like, stage and manufacturing, sales, post-sales, services, etc., etc. So trying to understand the whole chain and understanding where, like, foreign investors in the UK stand in this chain in terms of what type of function and where are investment in the country located in terms of different value addition stages. So are, like, new investment going to fundamentally do low value added activities to deliver finished product to the local market, or to services to the local market, or, like, are these investments strategic and adding a significant amount of value in the UK? Because we know that the investments that add most of the value are also the one that boost productivity, are the one that generate this type of like positive spillovers that Davide was mentioning. So I think it's very important to think about like these business functions and understand what type of activities is the UK attracting and where. And if I think about that, then we see that the dynamism in terms of attracting R&D, design activities of the one that control a lot of value addition are mostly driven by a supportive ecosystem, by public research, investment in public R&D, et cetera, and the investment that we see flowing are mostly reflecting conditions that are already established, because they take these are also the investment that take more time to plan and implement, and therefore the flow of investment. I think about patents, for example. I think about like R&D intensive type of activities in the design, in the R&D stage. They are mostly reflective of the strength of the past. While if we think about moving forward, we really need to make sure that these strengths are maintained. And for example, was yesterday in the newspaper, still there is no clarity, for example, on the UK membership of Horizon Europe, the largest research and collaborative research program in the world. And it's not only like the lack of participation in Horizon Europe, but it's the lack of a credible alternative that undermines the possibility for like R&D, in particular when it comes to research in some key strategic sectors, to plan investment in these particular areas. So this is like where I think we should be particularly mindful of observing signals, because we might not see, and also because they are not particularly accurate when it comes to these functions, what Davide was mentioning before. But if we try and look at those, if we look at the signals, even if we still see some very important like investment in this area lending, we should like question ourselves and see how and to what extent the conditions that have led to these decisions that in many cases like are even pre-pandemic and pre-Brexit, how and to what extent the right condition will still be in place today for these decisions to be taken now and materialize in the form of new investment in 4 or 5 years from now. In particular, because the technological competition in these key areas has increased, in particular because the landscape is changing a lot more dynamically in some key areas of technology now than, for example, 10 years ago. So competition is harsher. The technological frontier is shifting faster. So how is the UK positioning itself there? So I think there is an important point in terms of understanding the business functions that is that we should really like think through and reflect and understand how to what extent the right conditions are still in place, because the risk is that then once we see like the trend really changing, then it might be too late. And if I may add, this is relevant for new investments, so the type of data that we monitor, but also another key variable that we should monitor are expansions of existing foreign activities in the country. So how and to what extent? Because I mean, as if like we have for workers, we might have a sort of silent quitting. So okay, I'm not committing to my employer like as much as it was before because I'm not rewarded. I don't think I'm growing as much as I would like. So I don't quit, but I just reduce my effort. In the same way, many foreign firms are making decisions in terms of not divesting, but they might decide to reduce their activity, or like, for example, not launching a new model, if we think about current manufacturing in the UK, but move towards manufacturing 4.0, for example, in Central Eastern Europe. So you don't see these in new FDI data, but you might see these in terms of lower expansions, in terms of new hire, for example, by foreign firms that you would otherwise observe in the UK in a different scenario. So it's very important to monitor also in trying to get signals from expansions and divestment data from foreign firms, and always reflect in a type of counterfactual framework in the sense, okay, something might look positive, but we need to assess that positive vis-a-vis what would have happened in a different scenario.
Well, guys, I just want to follow up, and this is an incredibly interesting point that in real time, all of us are concerned at the moment about inflation in real time and what interest rate response will be. And we have this kind of data that we're able to look at and take a view as to what the policy intervention would be. Do we have that kind of mapping of the whole of the UK so that we can look at these things and decide which sectors which regions are doing badly to what we might have anticipated, and then decide upon some form of policy intervention that could happen within a meaningful timescale. That seems to be a problem that continues as well, even when we identify a problem. It seems to be quite hard to get together enough of a policy intervention. Forgive me, but I just thought I'd want to ask that as a follow-up to you.
Well, I think it's a very important point, the problem of data, in the sense of being able to capture the signals and inform real-time public policy decisions. We are asked to make decisions in a very information scarce environment.
Right.
And it is paradoxical, given the importance of FDI, given the importance of these decisions for the national economy, how limited the available data are and how limited the granularity of the data is in terms of understanding beyond like FDI as a macroeconomic phenomena. Where are these investments taking place? So what type of establishments are being created? What type of establishments and where, like activities expanding? What specific functions are these companies pursuing in the national economy? Now we have information on the sector of activity, sometimes on the legal location of the investment, but we don't know if the legal location, like where the legal entity is registered, really corresponds to where like the activities where jobs are being created. And then we don't know what exactly, in many cases, what exactly this foreign company is doing in terms of, okay, is it a shop or is it a post-sale type of services that might generate like jobs and might create, or is it an R&D? Or a design center. So I think on this information, we have very scattered data. We rely sometimes on private suppliers. So we need to compose a sort of jigsaw in order to be able to depict a richer picture vis-a-vis what we have in the standard aggregate data on FDI flow. So this is definitely a challenge.
The problem is not picking up on this is that, of course, there are data, but they are not official sources of data, and so we don't have the official the National Statistics Offices that provide this data. So we have to always take this data with a grain of salt, in a sense, and that's clearly a problem.
Yes.
Well, if I just may respond to that, so I agree with the data issue, and I do think that's a big concern. So as you've seen in some of the documents that came from the Productivity Institute, Nigel Driffield, who's sort of our FDI expert, is relying very heavily on Orbis data, which are private sector data. I think what is particularly problematic here is that there is just no good interaction between the office, the ONS and other statistical officers and these private sector data, who actually have these data much more timely. So, for example, when it comes to the difference between new FDI and what's happening to existing FDI, I mean, there's nothing in the official statistics that can give us some granularity on this, whereas the private sector data actually help us a little bit to understand these things. So I would also, I wonder if there's any comment on that, but plea for the official statistics to really sort of rely much more heavily on these private sector data, and obviously then make sure, to identify where the problems are and where the areas for improvement are in order to get a better data availability on this. But going back to the original question, I'd like also, of course, to hear from the other witnesses about sort of what they would like to add to sort of the makeup of investment, in particular also whether we have been seeing a change in trend over the past 4 years, which partly, of course, post-Brexit, but then also post-pandemic, we've seen other changes in trends, and it will be quite important and interesting to understand what your views on that are.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, we have seen a change in the makeup of investments. We've seen less investments aimed to use facilities to export, so export platform type of investments. And we're seeing more investment that are targeting the UK markets. Of course, as Reza was mentioning, market access is key. So probably we are looking at a new equilibrium where the level of investment will be lower, because if investors are seeking to serve the UK market, we might have fewer investments, but they may be different from how they are now. We may see more R&D investments, possibly. But if we go back to the market access type of investments, we just had a couple of days ago confirmation that Tata will build a gigafactory in the UK, apparently after securing a large, as the minister said, one large financial support from the government. So the point is that this investor, Tata, which of course owns Jaguar Land Rover, is the second largest producer of cars in the UK. And so it's not surprising that they're building a factory in the UK, because the UK is the largest market. So one wonders what happened with the other producers for whom the largest market is not the UK. And so recently in the press, if we compare the amount of giga factory capacity in Europe, UK stands around 100 gigawatt hour, while Germany stands at 400. So clearly, the market in Germany is more attractive for installing gigafactories. And one wonders, what is the amount of financial supports that investors will require to set up a factory in the UK if it's not if the market for cars in the UK is not as big as the neighboring market. So that's an issue, of course, that we need to address, and it's about the level and of course the makeup of investments. I agree. When it comes to the, say, productivity potential for investment, it's very difficult to say. Of course, as Riccardo was mentioning, high value-added activities are probably more conducive to more positive R&D and productivity effects. I would say that also investments that have a more larger multiplier effects. So investments where there's more input-output relations are also potentially leading to more externalities. And here I'm referring to this kind of pecuniary externalities that I mentioned before. So in that sense, if we want to leverage foreign investments, we should embed them in the local economy and foster interactions, market transactions, not necessarily knowledge transfer transactions, but at least market transactions with the local economy.
Let me follow up with one question. Maybe Risa also wants to come in on this as well, but picking up on the issue of the externalities and the spillover. So I'd like to look a little bit at the other end of this, and that is the absorption capacity of the local firms to receive the spillovers from this FDI that's being done. So can you talk a little bit about, is the absorption capacity of domestic firms in the UK okay in terms of receiving those spillovers, and what are the characteristics of firms to really get better in this? So it's basically look at the other end of the spillover story.
I have nothing to add really on this question. In the financial industry, it's not really an issue of inflows. It's a question of limiting outflows. And the only observation I make there is where outflows have been much more limited has been the buy side, i.e. those who manage pools of assets, asset managers, hedge funds, the holders of assets. There has not been much outflow, but equally there have not been new inflows into that market or setting up of new firms. So if there is, it's small.
The counterfactual point that Riccardo made earlier, that it may not have fallen, but one might have imagined more growth in some sense.
Exactly. But on the sell side, where banks mainly and other financial firms are providing services, obviously they have had to cater to a big market. Individual countries not as big as the UK market, but collectively a big market in Europe. So that has been relocations of capital and assets and people. And that, I think, is slow but sure increase in outflows. You don't see big numbers, but you don't see expansion of finance in London. You see gradual decline, and that decline will continue because, say, many firms are simply not hiring here. As people leave, they hire on the continent. On the buy side, it's not happening so much, but also there, the Europeans have not been able to kind of attract those pools of funding onto the continent, but it's something they're definitely looking at. So I think with finance is a question of defense.
Can I add, like on the point of absorptive capacities? I think this is a very important point. And when we look at the absorptive capacity of UK firms in terms of absorbing FDI spillovers, we do see that there's a significant difference in terms of the size. So across the firm size, absorptive capacity are highly heterogeneous, where like larger domestic firms are better at benefiting from spillovers. But I think it's important to reflect on the competition aspect, because here, when we say that foreign firms are reorienting their investments towards serving the UK market, given that the EU channel is becoming at least more costly, this means that UK domestic firms face more competition by these foreign firms. So while before a foreign investor would use the UK as a stepping stone to serve the EU market, given that now this EU market is more costly to access, this means that foreign firms, given their existing investment, given that they already have some cost, that they have already installed capacity in the UK, are reorienting their firing power towards the UK economy. This means more competition for domestic companies. So when we think about like these effects, we need to think about the potential positive spillovers, but also like for example, the competition effect. So we have competition, higher competition on the product markets.
Might that help domestic productivity?
Well, I mean, it might, to the extent to which, like, okay, we have more competition domestically, but this might also displace a lot of the like domestic companies. So in terms of like aggregate productivity data, you might see that, but when you look at like then who is like repatriating the profits, or like who owns, who control these productivity gains, then the distribution is very uneven in terms of the ownership structure of different companies.
And maybe one thing to add to that is indeed that this could lead to significant more competition, particularly also for high-skilled labor.
Exactly, that's the competition on the factor market. That's the other, because what we have done with Brexit, we have also constrained the labor market. So the issue is that we are dealing with a constrained labor market where like foreign investor then add in terms of that type of competition in a labor market that is already overheated and constrained, and they sort of compete with domestic firms on the high end, on the high skilled part of the labor market very often. And like Davide was mentioning, and Lisa was mentioning before, they also pay on average higher salaries. So it's also, if you want, not a fair competition because they win, no? So they get the best in the labor market. So there is competition on the product side, but also on the factor market, in particular when it comes to skilled labor. So in this context, like the potential positive effects of FDI is sort of constrained because the absorptive capacities of domestic firms suffers because of the changed environment. And I'd like to add the third element, that is the GVC perspective that was mentioned before, that sometimes like UK firms were acting as a piece of a puzzle. So they were not the only suppliers, but they were like supplying foreign firms by sourcing inputs from other firms located in the EU. So they were part of a chain. Now, this chain, the possibility to to acquire inputs in manufacturing and services in a seamless manner from EU-based firms is at least more complicated than it was before. And this is damaging the capacity, the absorptive capacity of UK firms, because they cannot play the same role that they were playing before as being like key, if you want, gatekeepers of a wider network, because of these like network capabilities being impeded by the new relationship or the lack of clarity on the relationship between the UK and EU. So this also reduces the absorptive capacity, the capacity of UK firms to benefit from FDI.
Yeah, just to add on the issue of absorptive capacity, I have research ongoing with Nigel Driffield and my colleague Katisha Laboratory, where we try to understand at what level absorptive capacity matters, whether it is at the level of the region, the territory, the sector, or the firm. We find, and we use UK data, we find that the level that matters is the firm. So, you know, all sort of investment that the local authorities or the governments can make at the local level can improve the ability of firms to absorb the spillovers, but it's just a minor portion of the or what you can get by increasing the absorptive capacity of firms. What determines the absorptive capacity of firms? We don't have, you know, a lot of information, but we tend to find that initial productivity of the firm is a crucial variable. So firms that are more productive are more able to absorb the potential productivity spillovers, which is sort of worrying from a policy perspective, because you are widening the gap between the firms that already are close to the frontier and the firms that are trying to catch up. How to solve this? Of course, it's a very tricky question to answer, because you know, the key point is to increase the productivity of the firms, so to enable them you know, human capital, other, you know, investments in managerial practices and so on and so forth, to enable firms also to be willing to learn from the potential and to absorb the potential externality from multinational firms. But of course, this issue of widening gaps between the firms that are lagging behind and the firms that are already at the frontier is not solved by FDI. And if our results are correct, FDI will widen this gap more than reduce it. But I think it's also relevant to mention that, of course, you know, a very productive firm in a lagging region is probably more likely to benefit from multinationals than a lagging behind firms in a frontier region. So this is what our findings suggest. It's more about the capabilities of the firms than the capability of territories or the potential spillovers in sectors, which I think is quite interesting and
that's quite interesting indeed, and perhaps also suggest that indeed the functioning of the ecosystem in which the domestic firms and the foreign firms are operating matters quite a lot in terms of whether they can bridge that gap between the less productive firms and the FDI firms themselves. May I, Jackie, if you allow me, can I ask one final small question? And that is somewhat related, of course, to this, but has to do much more with the nature or the identity of the FDI firm, or perhaps the nature of control of the firm, of the foreign investor, in whether we can generate a spillover. So, for example, you know, are private equity foreign investors more successful in generating some of these spillovers than privately owned firms, or is it just the other way around? So, any thoughts about whether any kind of legal or ownership characteristics or governance characteristics of the investors make a difference for the impacts it can have on productivity more widely?
Well, I'm not aware of any, you know, clear-cut results on that. So what I can say is that you know, it seems that if you look at acquisitions versus greenfield, also it's not clear-cut which one is best, because if you think about crowding out in competition, when you have greenfield, you add to the competition and the crowding out, and you have acquisitions, you have a change in ownership, and this will probably translate into firms being better managed when they are acquired. And so, in fact, there's a study that I'm aware looking at innovation in European regions, where it shows that there's more positive effects when inward investment coming from acquisition than greenfield investments, because the acquisition do not break the networks of researchers, while greenfield poach researchers from other firms, to disrupting, in a sense, the relationship between inventors. So I thought that was quite interesting. But of course, there are all sorts of studies going in different directions, and I'm not sure. No, I'm not aware of any study that definitely says venture capital or private equities or state-owned firms, for that matter, change significantly.
Thank you.
Ricardo, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think David raised a good point with reference to the entry mode. So there is research trying to understand the link between the entry mode of foreign firms and there is tradition in the literature, a sort of assumption that when we think about FDI, this is mostly about greenfield investment, while we really need to see what is the impact of an acquisition on the host economy, and how this leads to different patterns in terms, for example, of selecting your suppliers, in maintaining employment levels, in the diffusion of managerial practices, etc., etc. So it's very interesting to reflect. But I think the evidence is very much heterogeneous. Very much depends on the place. It very much depends on the investment motive. So what is the investment? If you acquire a chain of supermarkets, it's different vis-a-vis acquiring a research center, and the different entry modes are used in different ways, depending also on what type of functions, again, foreign companies want to mobilize in the host economy. So, but in terms of ownership, I think the important issues is that this links maybe with something we discuss later with the geopolitical framework. And so we need to think about ownership in terms of business groups, so beyond the individual company, but try to understand who is really controlling the activities. What is the impact of the heightened screening on foreign FDI, on FDI flows? Because once we say, then certain FDI we like, others, depending on who controls the activity, we don't. So there was a big shift, because if we think about post financial crisis, there was a lot of emphasis on emerging market multinationals and investment from emerging economies, and saying this is good because they have a different economic cycle. It's good to attract investment from emerging economies. However, today we are a lot more mindful in terms of investment coming in certain sectors from particular countries, in terms of how and to what extent the investor is reliable, how and to what extent certain investment in some key sectors might pose a security threat to the country. And this is true in the EU. The EU is passing a number of directives and is reinforcing the FBI screening on security grounds. The UK has also its own regulation and its own procedures in place. So I think that's an interesting question in terms of how our understanding of who ultimately owns the investment might change the time, because there is a filtering. There is control, there is screening on these investments. So how the screening might alter the geography, might alter the impacts of the activities that do land in the domestic economy, and how and to what extent different ownership structure might lead to more or less impatient capital. And this has important implications on the resilience of foreign activities in the UK, because how and to what extent these are investors that are looking for short-term returns vis-a-vis really wanting to establish a more long-term relationship with the country. So I think understanding ownership in a business group perspective is important, because also links our understanding of FDI impact with the changing geopolitical landscape. And I think this is an important piece of the puzzle.
I'd like to thank Bart for putting the questions in that section, but I think what you've said is a wonderful segue to the next section, and I'd like to introduce Tony Venables, who will ask some questions to do with the international investment and the new global trade landscape. Tony.
I was about to introduce the word resilience into the conversation. Yeah, okay, so a new world perhaps, deglobalization, probably not, but more disruption perhaps. Obviously from politics and wars and tariffs and subsidies and plagues and pestilence and drought. Anyway,
The rise of the apocalypse.
indeed. So is resilience an issue? To turn that into an answerable question, let me divide it into two bits. I mean, increasing awareness of resilience on the part of firms, is that going to change their behavior? We're going to see different patterns of FDI, or more or less, or obviously difficult interactions with trade here, because both are potentially disruptive. So, but any thoughts on that? And then the second sort of resilience question, are there market failures here? I mean, is it the case that firms underestimate the effect of the cost of shocks, the full social cost of shocks? In other words, the government should be doing something about reshoring, encouraging firms to reshore if that market failure is there. Or any other thoughts you have on resilience and this sort of aspect of the new world? I don't know who wants to start on that. I'd like to hear all thoughts on that pair of questions.
And I can start. So I think firms, but I guess firms have become more aware of the issue of resilience and risk, and there's a lot of consultancy studies that maybe firms looking more closely than academic work. So maybe they will be more mindful of the risk that they face by organizing, for example, global value chains, which are been designed for efficiency more than resilience. So I think it is clear in the minds of firms that these shocks will happen more frequently. That's why I was worried that you might ask me to predict what's going to happen next. But as they say, predict very often. So I don't know what's going to happen, but certainly if more shocks happen more frequently, then firms have to face this. And having all eggs in one basket, as we've been teaching in trade theory, finding the most efficient solution, the allocation of geographical distribution of production, clearly is showing some issues, and we need to include at least the issue of diversification. I'm not sure about reshoring, and actually, I have a study that I'm doing on Italy, and what it seems is that the firms that are reshoring are firms that have not made their homework correctly. So they are reshoring because they have overestimated the gains from offshoring, and they've underestimated the cost of offshoring. So those that are reshoring, they are not the most, I would say, virtuous of firms. They are, those who have made mistakes in a sense, and some of them will fail eventually after reshoring. So, and reshoring, if you put it in terms of resilience, in the resilience lens, I think reshoring is putting all eggs in one basket, which is the home country. And if the shock hits the home country, then there's no way out. Of course, my feeling is that the solution is some sort of diversification and redundancies built in supply chains. This, of course, will create some inefficiencies, and it will also have the problem that companies will have to trade off between the quality of their suppliers and the fact that they can have at least 2 or 3 suppliers for the same product, and this will affect the quality of the products and the cost of the product eventually. So this is clearly an issue, but the other possibility is to increase inventories, to have more time to react to shocks, but that also will increase cost. And I think I read that holding 9 days worth of production of cars would require a warehouse as large as probably like 50 football fields, football pitches. So clearly it's not viable there either. So either way, there will be some increase in cost and inefficiencies. But I don't think reshoring is the solution. I would see more as diversification of suppliers source in the value chain.
Not many thoughts. I mean, I can maybe say a few words from the point of view of financial investments. So the challenges the UK faces on FDI are part of a broader global dislocation that is taking place, and it is changing flows, both real money flows and financial flows. I can give you some examples across the world, and I do wonder if this is an angle that post-Brexit the UK has not focused on. You can see some countries have focused on it. For example, Mexico is incredibly focused on it, and their level of FDI is increasing very rapidly. Now, a lot of that FDI is coming from China in order to basically produce in Mexico and take advantage of US, Canada, Mexico trade act. But for instance, as an investor, what we see is if you look at some of the Latin American economies, the Mexican economy is being incredibly robust because of this massive inflow of FDI and the degree of activity, whereas other Latin American countries are facing difficulty in terms of they have high interest rates, economies which are not very buoyant. If you look at
Can I just understand the reason for this inflow into Mexico? Because they want to access NAFTA, but without being in the United States.
No, they want to be able to export to the United States and Canada without being in China or being in other emerging markets which have low. So it's not a question of not being in the US, it's a question of having somewhere where you can produce at reasonable cost and have good access to the North American market. So this is changing real flows. You see similar things in Asia, and different governments have different policies towards it. For instance, you see a lot of investment into Vietnam as a substitute for China investment. You see the Koreans benefiting because people want a safer place to produce chips. So there is a huge global trend here. And I would say in this context, the financial community's attitude towards China has changed 180 degrees in a very, very short period of time. The bank I was working with 4 years ago, one of the top managers saying, we should all be spending part of our time in China, working on China and shifting lots of people there. That attitude has completely reversed 180 degrees and, reducing, even if you have a banking license, reducing activity and reliance there. So I think there's a broader global pattern of geopolitical consideration. I think we look at Brexit as part of that, but I think it does have implications about how do you position the UK in terms of a destination for FDI.
can I just add? I mean, I agree with what has been said before, and I do think that like resilience is becoming part of the like reflection of companies when allocating their foreign activity. So the Russia shock with like fixed asset being completely like stranded there has changed and has in turn led to this reconsideration of like a possible China neutrality for many businesses. So say, okay, I don't want to have a similar exposure because I mean, but this has led to a reconsideration of alternative destinations, not with the idea, okay, some like emerging democracies might be like less efficient in some sense, but might be more stable. Think about Brazil, think about India as possible investment destination. Look at like investment flows. We have done something on global value chains in Asia, for example, the changing position of countries like Bangladesh, for example. So the whole region, there is a reshuffling of investment in the region linked with this change of in attitude towards how and to what extent China can be like a reliable partner for foreign investment. So is there like a market failure in terms of underestimating the cost of shocks? Maybe, but I mean, there is a quick adjustment, a quick updating of expectations, and we do see businesses like adjusting their like exposure to risk accordingly. So how and to what extent is this leading to reshoring? Like I agree with David that we really don't know. There isn't much in the data. We do see more like regional value chains. So we see that there is more redundancy. So I tend to like have additional sources for my inputs, some near shoring. So I might want to have some capacity, maybe some options to source nearer to me where I do see more stability. But if this is linked with like a big pattern of reshoring, well, it's not in the data. We don't see much. However, it's very important to consider that reshoring, when it happens, is very different to what politicians think it is. So when we looked at what happens to firms that do reshore and do not reshore because they are failed internationalizing companies, but they reshore because of exogenous shocks, for example, climate-related shocks or unpredictable geopolitical shocks, like what they bring back home are more capital-intensive processes that are compatible with the idea that they go more for automation. So what we see is a substitution of jobs in emerging economies with automated processes in advanced economies. This is like work done looking at French data that could, in principle, is reproducible also with UK data if we had the similar access to data in the UK as it is possible in France. But I think that this is like a pretty general result. So if we like take away this sort of endogeneity in terms of who is reshoring, if we take that out, I think we see that the reshoring story is not really what politicians are like thinking of. So we bringing jobs back to America or bringing, no? So that's really mostly about replacing jobs in emerging economies with automation. And I think the big question is what happens once this involves replacing jobs in services. So when this goes beyond manufacturing, that for the UK, like it's really a very small share of employment, but what happens when this starts and we start like applying AI more intensively to the service sector? So I think that's a very interesting question.
If I can add, there's also an interesting trend that has been observed in some sectors, which is re-internalization. So relying too much on global supply chain, global value chains, and independent suppliers, it's of course more problematic when you have these shocks. So you want to secure your supply stream, then you internalize. And companies like, for example, Tesla is much more vertically integrated than many of their competitors, and some of the competitors are going in that direction as well. So this will be an interesting direction. So this integration of that in the past 20 years, will it lead now back to some sort of the multinational strikes back? We could say something like that.
I'm going to ask one more question on this discussion. Subsidy wars. I mean, if grabbing multinational activity by subsidies, large scale is the name of the game, then, well, two questions. What does a small to medium sized economy do? What does the UK do in that sort of environment? And any thoughts on an international architecture to do something about it? I mean, the OECD did something on corporate tax competition, but that's not, that's not touching the sides on what's going on at present. But I'm looking at the clock as well, so I'm not sure we've got time for a complete discussion about international architecture, but there are real policy issues here for the UK.
But it could just be a start. You can make some points to start with, and then we can continue the discussion subsequent. It's important question to think about that.
I'd like to hear Tony's view on that. I don't know, I think we had an international architecture that kind of caters for that. It's been almost this month, even if it's still there. It's been not used for a while, and every country blame each other for not obeying to the WTO rules, but the rules were there. And now what do we do when I don't know, it's difficult. It's difficult because if the bigger countries that should design this architecture are the ones that are starting the subsidy war, it's a big problem. How do you bring them to the table? I don't have a clear answer. Certainly for the UK, especially outside the EU, is going to be an uphill struggle. And the example of the gigafactory is just one very prominent one. But of course, how many of these will the UK be able to secure, and what will be the impact for the long-term UK economy? It's unclear. And of course, and the battle that there is between the EU and UK about the exemption to the content or local produced content is another example. Of course, the EU has the upper hand there, and they know that the UK will have to budge, I think, in the end. So yeah, I don't think I have an answer to that. So, what I say is that this will lead to duplication of efforts. Think of the CHIPS Acts, will lead to inefficient plans which will not reach the efficient scale. From the subsidy hands, will they be able to stay on the market? We don't know, and so it's a challenge.
Yeah, if I may, I think on these subsidy wars, I think when it comes to the UK, there is the issue of bargaining power. And if there is an issue of what type of strategic alliances the UK wants to put in place, because if we think about when we discuss this with students, we use the example of Amazon headquarters too, and the competition among different jurisdictions in the UK to attract the second headquarters of Amazon, and basically 140 something jurisdictions submit bids to Amazon to attract the second headquarters. Okay, so that's a clear extraction of a rent by the multinational, leveraging taxpayers' money. So the issue is that then we say, okay, within the EU, this would be against the single market rules. It would be not possible to do that type of bargaining, at least in the same way and in the same explicit manner within the single market rules. So the whole single market and the whole European integration experiment is in a sense a way to avoid that type of subsidy wars, at least not with the same strength and in the same explicit manner. We do see some of these, if we think about airports, for example, like provincial airports, we do see still some of these sort of territorial competition, but not to the same extent. So the issue is, once the UK is not part of the EU anymore, given that the UK is not part of the EU anymore, what is the alternative model to mitigate the possibility to be on the passive side of this type of bargaining games from large multinational firms? I think this is also very important territorial implications. Again, going back to the geography of FDI within the UK and how this links with the productivity divide in the UK, because of course some areas having like less of an intrinsic advantage suffer more in terms of competing with other countries that use these subsidies in a more proactive manner. So it's investment that land in London, probably would land in London anyways. So London suffers less from other countries using these types of subsidies vis-a-vis other areas of the UK, because they are like more marginal in the investment preferences, so that the subsidy can really tilt at the margin more than in London. So I'm investing in London, or I am investing in Cambridge because I have a biotech investment, and that's the only place, or there are only a few places where I would go. But if I am undecided between 4 or 5 different locations, then the subsidy and the use of subsidies and the overall package might make a difference. So I think that's really, and there, I think we have a very interesting experimental field that comes from less advanced regions in Europe, because the so-called objective 1 regions have been exempted from some of the common market rules, given their particular status. And so understanding what happened there and how and to what extent they manage to attract and retain FDI in this type of games can be a nice experimental field for us to learn, like how to deal with this type of challenges.
I don't have much to add. I think as economists, we will all agree that this is where political economy and economics come very much into conflict. And I spent a good part of my working life trying to engineer international agreements on things like debt restructuring. Incredibly difficult to do until it's clear that the majority of players are losers of this. And that has become clear in the taxation, because you had Ireland, Luxembourg, and Netherlands, the winners, all the major countries in Europe and the G7 losers of this. And I think the winners and losers in this subsidy game is less clear. And you have different layers. You have the national level, as you said, you have subnational levels. And so until it becomes clear that the majority are losers of this, and it's a simple transfer to certain firms, it's difficult to be optimistic. But the solution is very similar to exactly the solution on the taxation. An agreement at the OECD level, just there's subsidies on the other side of taxation. It's you could almost fold it into that agreement. But remember that agreement is not yet ratified. Right? It requires ratification by the US Congress. And so you can see, given the layers of complexity within the US, getting the US on board with this is going to be very difficult. Now, at the EU level, of course, you have the state aid rules. So there was an umbrella there. It was quite a strict umbrella, which would be loosened at sometimes, particularly during COVID it was, but there was an umbrella there. And in a way, the competition commission in the EU had independent power to enforce that. And so I think there was a good system there, but of course, even now, some countries like France are trying to water down the state aid rules, but the state aid rules essentially deal with this issue to a large extent, because there is an avenue to address it.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. And we've already had a very lively conversation just now about policy. So this is a very good segue into the final section on how to improve international investment and the UK's productivity performance. There will only be, I think, time for 2 questions. So the first one is your perspective on some of the UK government's current policy proposals of creating investment zone, whether that is technology clusters or free ports or anything that is meant to attract investment, including international inward investment. So that would be one thing I'd like to get your view on briefly, but I'd also like you to tell us what you think would be a good policy or policies that the UK government should consider. Is it more going to be trade agreements and trade partnerships? Is it more along the lines of tax? We've just had a conversation about subsidies, so obviously we'll also reflect all your comments on that. But what would be a good intervention so that more investment comes in that also helps in the pursuit of reducing the regional inequalities that we know are, such a big problem? You've all touched on leveling up in one way or another, throughout your, incredibly interesting comments already. So investment zones, and what would be a good policy or set of policies that the UK government should consider in any order?
That is incredibly kind. Always, happy to pass the floor to someone.
It's a good one.
Let me start with the investment zones
Yes.
that you label as a new policy. I've been in the UK not long, but I read something, and it turns out it's not that new.
Sure.
There's a new flavor to something that has been tried in the past, and so in the past hasn't been very successful in terms of employment creation, and if anything, previous attempts have moved employment from one area to the other, which is not exactly what you want. So you want to create jobs, and I mentioned that in the leveling up kind of discourse. What you want is for Birmingham to attract investment, or for the Midlands in general to attract investment that would go to France rather than to London or to Scotland. So you want additional investments, and it's unclear whether investment zone will achieve that. In particular, because they don't change the underlying conditions for territory to attract firms. I can't mention something about that. So, even though the new investment zones are attached to universities, and so there's a new twist. I think, again, I don't have the crystal ball, so it doesn't seem very different from the past. So if it hasn't worked in the past, I'm not sure that the conditions have changed significantly so that it works now. I think I would welcome more policies that tackle some of the weaknesses of territories that make these territories not attractive for multinationals. And one thing that attracts firms is, of course, agglomeration economies, which creates, and here I think Tony knows something about that, about core and periphery. So in order to attract investments in the periphery, you need to do something, so in the periphery, there's less agglomeration, so firms are less likely to want to go there, in a sense. And so what do we do? What do you do? Well, there's some literature in the international business now emphasizing, for example, the role of connectedness of places. So, and I think as I mentioned, the possibility of flying in and out, or flying people or goods, connecting ideas, IT infrastructure. So these things allow probably firms to be sort of more isolated, more in the periphery, but still benefit from some sort of agglomeration economies from a distance. It's a long shot, but at least it can give probably an opportunity for more peripheral areas. And of course, there are certain investments where these agglomeration economies are more important than others. And so in that respect, my answer would be, try and tackle why a place is not attractive for investment in the first place. Why won't talent go and live in a place where then the presence of talents can attract, for example, R&D investments in a certain place? What kind of policy? I think I'd add to, you mentioned trade, you mentioned tax. I mentioned before immigration rules and mobility of people is probably as important as those that you have mentioned. So allowing talent to move to certain places, whether they come from within the country or outside the country, can be a powerful factor that can attract investment. So I would add that to the portfolio of possible policies. But yeah.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Davide mentioned. I think there is, however, an important, like, general, like, horizontal aspect in terms of, like, FDI policies that has to do with the value proposition of the UK. In the sense, like, how is the UK, like, presenting itself to foreign investors? And, like, before Brexit, the idea was to live with market access, with being the most advanced, dynamic, bureaucracy-free stepping stone towards the EU market. Now this has fundamentally changed, that this is unclear what value proposition is replacing that pre-existing value proposition. So I think the issue is, in terms of policies, we need clarity in terms of the value proposition of the UK. We need clarity in terms of the link between trade and investment. We keep discussing about trade deals, but we need to see these as trade and investment deals, because trade and investment are really two sides of the same medal. And then there is the issue of what is the investment promotion structure as well, because at the moment, the whole investment promotion structure of the UK is incredibly confusing. We have multiple points of contacts at the national level, a multiplicity of agencies at the subnational level, with a structure that is unclear across the different. London has multiple agencies, and then so it's, when compared with other European countries, we have done research on the investment promotion structure across European countries, and the UK structure is so complicated that you couldn't even keep the UK within the same sample as other European countries, for example. So this tells you, like, a lot. So there is an issue of value proposition and investment promotion structure. In terms of, like, what type of policies, like investment zones, I really, like, if I look at, like, the use of investment zones across the globe, I mean, with this term, you can mean so many different things that it's unclear, like, what medication you are referring to. Okay, and this can be such a diverse combination of active ingredients that it's very hard to say, okay, does it work or not? So Davide said in the past it was not successful, but it very much depends on, like, what tools you put into the medication. So I don't know what the active ingredients are. Is it about tax breaks? Is it about facilitation? It's about building the investment ecosystem. It's such a complicated cocktail of policy that it's very hard to use, like, standard policy evaluation techniques to be able to say what works and what doesn't. So we really need clarity on the tools in order to make sure that the policy mix delivers additionality, so that we get more investment rather than fostering displacement. So we're just moving investment around, sometimes a few kilometers, vis-a-vis where they would have gone naturally, like showing that we are using taxpayers' money to attract investment that otherwise would have not landed in the UK. That is what Davide was mentioning. And when thinking about investment zone, whatever defined, my impression is that in the current landscape, trying to attract new greenfield investment is not necessarily the low-hanging fruit. When you discuss with investment promotion agencies across the globe, they tell you that expansions of existing investment is really like the low-hanging fruit, the cheapest thing to do. Because convincing firms, in particular, given the significant uncertainty that dominates the global landscape, trying to attract a new greenfield investment really requires a lot of effort. So it's a lot easier for them to work on existing foreign investors that already have knowledge of the market, have already decided to invest in the market, and convince them to expand. The Tata decision very much goes in that direction. So it's more, okay, it is recorded as a new greenfield investment, it's fundamentally an expansion of existing operations within the country. So I think we really need to, like, carefully consider, like, what we also want to target. And I think at the moment, preventing divestment and fostering expansions can be more of a low-hanging fruit, a cheapest target to achieve, vis-a-vis trying to reshape greenfield investment. And finally, when thinking again, what kind of policy, I think we really need to like reflect on investment promotion in all these three key dimensions: attraction, retention, and expansion. But really seeing, okay, what type of investment promotion structure we want, what is the role of labs, if any, or other bodies that can think about investment attraction in the country and in a more streamlined investment promotion structure that in other countries has been proven to be successful with solid like policy evaluation methods. And I think, final point, I promise, it also means like linking FDI policies with a wider set of policies. So we can not only think about like engaging with foreign investors, but thinking about we call them in a short book GVC sensitive, global value chain sensitive policies. That is not only FDI policies, but it's also when you think about what type of infrastructure do I want, I really think about like infrastructure that is designed to facilitate my connectivity to investment networks and to global value chain. When I think about what type of skills do I want to invest on, I'm not only thinking about my domestic market, but I think about what type of skills are needed for the country to harness the benefits from global value chain. So it's thinking about FDI policies as a framework for a wider set of policy and something that fits back into the wider policy discussion.
Thank you.
I told you it was Easter, right?
No, really, yeah.
Yes, Reza, please, and then
Maybe answer your first question on investment zones, free trade zones. Almost every single IMF emerging market program I worked on, the finance minister or other political leaders wanted to set up one. And the experience, at least in emerging markets, was it ended up usually being a means of providing tax benefits or subsidies. The only times where I could see some value was when, for instance, infrastructure was not good, or services that investors required, or access to point of contact that could sort issues out for them was not available. And so it could have done that in alternative ways, but it could be helpful. So for the UK, I would say, look, we have amazing universities here. And attaching, there have been some very successful science parks or investment parks and so on. Connecting knowledge with investment could be a useful thing. And there's already lots of very good examples here. Look at Warwick Science Park, for instance, Cambridge one, they are incredibly successful. Now, on your broader question in terms of, okay, what should one focus on an FDI? I go back to my 7 points at the beginning.
Which one? Now known as the 7 pillars of modern.
Of course, you need better market access. It has been curtailed. Anything there, even a kind of blueprint of improving that is going to be helpful. Talent, you need to be able to, as a business, to recruit talent internationally and internally. You need talent, so you need training, etc. Political social stability, I'm less worried about it, despite all our ups and downs. We have, you could say, if you look, a lot of countries who have gone through political upheavals, extremism, and so on, have developed here. I think the society has managed it. Social tension is not there, so I'm not too worried about it. But I think investors do worry about it. So there is some reassurance to be done, and there is need for a bit of track record. I think regulatory predictability and credibility, I think that is still there, but it does need reassurance because every so often people, okay, we need to completely relook at all the rules and so on. That's, you know, so I think some degree of predictability, some degree of, okay, we have looked at it, now this is where we are going. You need again that sense of strategy. I'm not so worried about taxation issues for the UK. I think that's a global issue. As I mentioned at the outset, the costs to business that are ongoing and irrespective of the state of economy, like social security taxes, I think the UK is fairly competitive on those. So I don't see that as a problem, but businesses do care about that. And taxation systems in this country tend to be reasonably in line with good practice. Not everything is perfect, but reasonably in line with good practice. When you look globally, I give you one example, for instance, in France, for the financial sector, social security taxes are imposed on not just the salary, but also bonuses. So it's very, very high compared to the US. So the UK one is sort of sensible in many ways. And network effects, I mean, you know, generally there are good network effects here. So I think it's a question of preserving them. On infrastructure, I think Ricardo made a point, there are issues there, but I think again, in terms of things like IT networks, spaces, airports, we have a very good basis. Obviously, things could be better, but well, that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you, Tony. And thank you, Bart. Thank you, Steve. It's been a wonderful session. Really enjoyed it. I'm going to ask you one final question and just give a brief answer, then I'll sum up and explain where we're going to next. As I get a sense, and the problem with when you get people like us in a room, we're always looking for optimality. We're looking for something that is perfect. And of course, there's no such thing as perfection. There are market failures, there are rigidities, there are information asymmetries. There are even policy mistakes, heaven forfend, things that happen that we wish hadn't happened. But to the extent to which we might think that historically the UK has been a great recipient and also outward investor in FDI, and for whatever set of reasons we might be below where we'd like to be right now in terms of inward and outward investment. If we started to do the right things in the way that you've talked about today, in terms of policy, trying to measure things, trying to understand individual firms and sectors, and build a structure that fosters investment, how long do you think it might take us to get back to where we ought to be? What kind of planning horizon should we be thinking? That's my, you don't necessarily have to answer. That's what I want to put to you as a sort of a thought process for us to be thinking about in terms of the advice we might give to this government or an ex-government about the kind of things we need for an FDI regime. Perhaps I'll start with you, David, because you're near us. There we go. Go to the card.
Well, as I said, predicting is very difficult, and it's not something that I'm very confident. Predicting the future is very difficult. My impression is that we are to expect a different equilibrium. So we are probably landing at a different place where we were 5 or 10 years ago. And that means that in terms of we might not be able to get back to that level of investments, but the investment might change. And so, you know, the advice would be get the most out of the investment that will come to the UK and try to get the most benefits of the local economy. So in terms of, you know, spillovers or, you know, externalities in general, yeah, that is probably what I see at the moment. In the very long term, so if the economy really grows dramatically, and if, you know, relations might change with our neighbors, then we might see some, you know, another equity will emerge. But I think that for me, that would be the most sensible thing to do.
Thank you, David. Ricardo.
Well, I mean, reflecting on the time frame, on the time scale for things to change. I think that technology is changing quite quickly. So we are in a turning point moment in which, like, the use of technologies and in particular the application of technologies to services is changing quite quickly. So on the one hand, on the other, like the global, like, geopolitical landscape is also evolving quite quickly. So I think this creates, of course, challenges, but there are also opportunities. So the global distribution of investment is not like set in stone as it would be in a very, like, stable, static moment. Therefore, I think if the right changes, if the right conditions are in place, like, the benefits could materialize in a relatively, like, shorter period that we would expect in a different, like, global and technological landscape. So I think this is a difficult landscape to navigate, but at the same time, the right policies implemented at the right time might give benefits in a much shorter time horizon that we might expect.
Very interesting point.
I agree with that. I think provided the direction of policy is supportive, I think it is possible to turn around the sort of decline that we have had in FDI, but it will take time because these are issues that require reassurance that institutions remain strong, that the economic and political system remains strong, and given the upheaval we have been through last few years, not just here, as I said earlier, globally, I think one needs to think of this as the life of 1 to 2 governments, i.e. 5 to 10 year horizon. This is not something that will give results in the short term. It requires consistent progress along my 7 points, of course.
Seven pillars of evidence.
So, but I would say this is the life of 1 to 2 governments, 5 to 10 years.
Thank you very much, Reza. I think what I've learned so much in this term. I'm very, very grateful to the commissioners, but particularly to the witnesses. I'm getting a sense of having to drill down at a very granular level. We need to understand what the firms are doing, the sectors and the regions. It's not enough to look at the aggregate picture. We know that anyway. We do that in all macro and micro analysis at the Institute, but it's very, very clear about the heterogeneity, particularly here. We've learned a lot about the best practices that we might learn by bringing FDI experience into this country, but also the connections between trade and investment and labour, high-skilled labour. These are things that shouldn't be dealt with independently. They of course aren't amongst us, but often in the public discourse they are. And I think that's very important for us to think about. The opacity, the lack of understanding of the detail seems to be clear time and time again when it comes to issues. That really clear point that you made very early on about just not knowing what's going on in real time well enough to understand it and draw conclusions from it, I think is quite a profound point for us. So there is so much for us to think about. We should look forward to thinking about it. We should certainly keep in contact with you. I think in the next day or so, we will put out a very brief summary of the key points that were made today without necessarily implementing or indicting you with having agreed with it. And then shortly afterwards, we'll issue a summary transcript of what we talked about today, which we'll share with you as well. And then at some point in the summer, we'll be putting out a report on what we've learned. But at any time, please feel free to maintain your contact. And if you wish to afterwards, send us your written evidence. And indeed, we'll get your 7 pillars laminated put on the walls of the Institute for us all to follow. Thank you, if I may, as well, to Issam Samiri for his help in getting a session together, Max Harvey and the External Affairs team at the Institute. I won't go through all the travails we've been through in the last day or two to get this put together. But also, if I may also thank very warmly Davide for breaking up his holiday to come and join us today. It's been very worthwhile from our perspective. I hope your family will forgive you for the good you've done for this country and future FDI. Ricardo and Reza, thank you very much as well. See you again soon.